Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, where we explore the ever-evolving world of technology and its impacts on our lives, our work and world. And today I've got a very special guest joining us. He's a Harvard graduate, skilled negotiator, CPaaS veteran with 2 patents under his belt, with a proven track record in the tech industry, generating over 400 million in tech sales and engineering multiple trade acquisitions. Yes, it's an honour to have Paul from Global Point View on the podcast today. Paul has launched innovative services such as Messaging Trust, which did win the Global Product Award for Best Cybersecurity Solution from the GSM Association back in 2013. He also led development of a voice recognition personal assistant interface for mobile phones called Wildfire. And that interface would later inspire Apple's Siri. And Paul has also worked with a wide range of tech giants, from Facebook to MasterCard and Western Union, and a variety of private equity firms too. But today, I've asked him to come on here and share his invaluable insights on the emergence of quantum computing and AI, and the applications in consumer-focused services such as conversational commerce and secure authentication, and also dive into the topic of effectiveness of text messaging in customer engagement, and in general, enhancing customer engagement through technology, global telecoms and messaging megatrends, and so much more to get through today. So buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to Washington, where Paul is waiting to share his story. Welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, my name is Paul Ruppert, and I've spent 2 decades in the mobile technology, media, and telecommunications segment, specifically in the messaging space. So something that we all do frequently all around the world. I've had the opportunity to be involved since its inception in the late 90s, helping launch one of the first what's called GSM mobile network operators in the U.S., which is now known as AT&T. I have operational experience and executive experience driving commercial growth in rank cockroach startups, as well as scale-ups and global Fortune 100 enterprises, including one where it was owned by the Carlyle Group, the largest private equity firm in the world. I've combined my executive experience and now moved into the consulting world, where my clients have included MasterCard, Western Union, LivePerson, as well as leading private equity firms such as HIG Capital, Warburg Pincus, and the National Bank of Kuwait. And it's great to be here, Neil. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have a conversation with you and your listeners.
Thank you for joining me. And you have had a hugely successful career, but I always like to take my guests back in the Wayback Time Machine and find out more about where it all began. So, Paul, can I ask you to share your origin story and your journey from launching Messaging Trust with AT&T to generating $6 million in revenues in its first year and winning the Global Product Award for the Best Cybersecurity Solution from the GSM Association? There's a lot to unpack there, but can you tell me more about where it all began?
Sure. Well, it was a few years ago, back in around 2012, which is when the idea started. And as any good story starts off, it was 2 guys in a bar in Tokyo, and I was one of the guys. And part of my job at that point, I was running the global messaging business, working with mobile network operators all around the world. And we had just finished a day with NTT Docomo. And this was a time where the notion of cybersecurity was just starting to get within the forefront of the public attention, which means that it had already been percolating along on the enterprise side as to these types of threats that might exist. And myself and my colleague at the time is a guy named Chris Wright, who was my technical lead on the team that I led. We just started talking about what could we do in this space so that we can identify this moment of innovation, this inflection point, and how could we put together a solution that might be able to address the various types of spam. And spam, in this case, it was SMS spam. And my idea, because of the business that we were in was globalized, but we were always concerned about, could spam bots and spam attacks occur cross-border or outside of your own border that then were attacking your network? So an example would be, let's say a mobile network operator in the UK like Vodafone would have been hacked, and then all of a sudden messages were flowing from Vodafone in the UK into Verizon in the US. And so we started looking into that and found that we knew that we did not have that functionality in our portfolio, but as in many things when it comes to technology, you start to look for alliances or partnerships with others who do. And we got one quote for an idea as to what would it take? How could you work with us? They wanted like over $1 million of an engagement fee. And that's when I pivoted and started looking and leveraging my own experience in a rank cockroach startup, which we could talk about a little later, that we took to a $500 million liquidity event in 5 years. But having gone through that experience myself, we decided to pivot and start looking for startups that were in this space. And we found one which was based in Ireland. It was called Adaptive Mobile. And they were very, very receptive to the idea because we were now going to provide them with multiple channels into multiple destinations and potential revenues, while the other one was a much older, bigger company. And so we decided to pivot to the Irish company. And we then started leveraging our relationships, our commercial relationships with the American operators, because we were American based, but we were a global company. We felt it would be easier to work with the American operators. So we went to our strategic partner, which was AT&T, and said, we've got a solution that might be helpful to you, and essentially provide them with automated means of detecting new types of spam and chatbot campaigns, which were now starting to emerge as a result of the lack of security and the bad guys essentially chasing money. And so we went to them and we put together a trial, a proof of concept with them, and it took off. And ironically, when we started looking at the traffic with Adaptive that they were targeting and monitoring, we did indeed find instances of cross-border spamming. And the reality of that, in terms of, let's say, a business threat, when you start thinking of anything that might be going on cross-border, that becomes the reality is that there are more cyber threats and more opportunities because nobody is really standing guard against international stuff, because it's an easy way to dodge domestic protection for mobile network operators. So that became something that became very high concern to those that were interested in that. And that's how we were able to get AT&T involved, and it moved the needle in terms of the types of revenues that we would be able to secure and harvest in our first year. And in the second year, we did even better. So that's kind of the quick thumbnail story of messaging trust. And it's still in play, still being offered by Cineverse, which is the company that I was with at that time.
And all the best stories always begin with, I was with a couple of guys in a bar in Tokyo. I'm curious, what put you in that bar? Is there a story there? Was there any serendipity or the universe putting you in that situation?
What got me there was I've been involved in the telecommunications business, as I mentioned early on. And one of the first jobs that I had, this is actually the second job I held 6 months into the opportunity. I was asked to put together a kiosk rental program in all of the international airports in California, Nevada, Seattle, or Washington State and Oregon, which is where our footprint was. And because back then, and we're talking now 1997, there was no interstandard roaming functionality in a handset. Now, that's a very complicated description of it. Means that even though it was GSM based, if you were getting off a plane from London and you were a Vodafone client, and even though both the US GSM, the US network that we operated was GSM and Vodafone is GSM, your phone wouldn't work, believe it or not. And that was way, way back. But within about 9 months, Motorola and others, Ericsson, Nokia, etc., were able to figure that out. And so that business very quickly got shut down. And then I was transferred from being a rental kiosk business development executive into, okay, we want you now to go off and connect our network with all the other mobile network operators around the world. There were about 1,000 of them back then. And that translated into a title of International Roaming Director. And what does an International Roaming Director do? Well, back in the 90s, I used to spend a lot of time flying from San Francisco to other destinations around the world, sitting down with other mobile network operator executives like myself, and we would establish roaming agreements that covered not only the technical identification of inbound roamers and outbound roamers from our various networks, but also the SMS functionality between mobile network operators. Great job, great perspective on a global industry who was able to be at the right point at the right time, especially in terms of the adoption of mobile handsets and people using mobile phones to be able to communicate. And then in 2007, that exploded even more so with the reality of iPhones and smartphones. And so it wasn't by accident that I was in Tokyo. I happened to be at this stage a little bit beyond that initial job with an operator. And now this time I was with the mobile services vendor, specifically focusing on the messaging business. And we were pitching a solution to NTT Docomo, as well as back then what was the precursor of SoftBank, which was a mobile network operator. So yeah, there was a reason I was there, and then we were just trying to figure out what else could we do with our capabilities, and that's how we fell into that golden lined hole, if you will.
And when I was doing a bit of research on you before you came on the podcast, I also learned that I think you brokered a $6 million joint investment between Microsoft and AT&T to fund the trial launch of a voice recognition personal assistant interface known as Wildfire. But that went on to evolve into something we all know now as Siri. Again, Another great story, right? Can you share that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And that goes back into my days of running rental kiosks. One of the products that I was involved in was this newly emerging functionality called Wildfire. And it was essentially voice-activated personal assistant on your phone. So back then, like the command was, I think it was a *7 or something like that, which would activate the phone, and then you would say Wildfire, and then all of a sudden the voice-activated personal assistant would say, "Here I am," and then I could say call, and then Wildfire would come back saying, "Call who?" "Call Neil Hughes." Yeah. "Which number?" So you would have this dialogue that was going on. Again, this is 1997 or so. And there's even a much more interesting wrinkle to this story. There's a guy named Rich Miner. Now, some of your audience may know who Rich is. Rich was the head of business development for this company called Wildfire. And it wasn't a mobile services company. They were doing some kind of video editing solution, and they came up with this idea of having voice-activated capabilities of personal assistant through your mobile handset. And though this is very, very early on in the technology of mobile services. And Rich and I worked to get on this project. And the idea was, okay, we being Pacific Bell Mobile Services, looked at a number of different initiatives. And many times we looked at them as, could we mine this opportunity from this startup? Or could we actually partner with the startup? Or what else could we do to help them along? And that's when we saw the opportunity as to essentially a corporate development initiative, much like a venture capital arm or venture capital firm would make an investment in the company. And instead we decided, okay, let's make this investment, but we want to mitigate our risk. At the same time, Microsoft was still stumbling around in the mobile space. They were looking for an opportunity, and the two of us combined. Now back to Rich. Where did Rich go? Well, Rich now today runs Google's venture capital arm, Google Ventures. So he had a much better story than mine, but he had an instrumental hand in that. Now the problem at that time, the technology was that when we started doing testing with this, and how do you do testing? Well, you put it in the lab, but you also put it in the field. And we would take it out, and we would find that every time we would roll the windows down in a car, just the windows, it would drown out the command. So it wasn't very effective. And in the end, the technology didn't adapt, and it didn't connect. And so we decided to walk away from that. This was about 2 years or so after I was involved in it. I'd moved into the roaming. And so that technology was hanging out there, and Steve Jobs and Apple's wisdom and vision, they decided to repurpose the technology. I'm not sure it's exactly the Wildfire platform, but it was functionally an antecedent to it, if you will.
And I love how you've been along for the entire ride here in the industry. And fast forward to 2023, I'm curious, what do you see as the most significant global telecom and messaging megatrends that businesses and indeed individuals should be aware of in the coming years? Is there anything catching your eye at the moment?
Oh yeah, sure. The reality of any innovation, in my view, is that it's really evolutionary, not revolutionary. You have very few opportunities. We were talking about the 2007 emergence of the iPhone. Well, that didn't happen overnight. The reality is that these things gradually progress and improve. And then at some point, this is how I look at the mobile business. And if you look at its own history, it is a massive phenomenon, historically, commercially, psychologically, socially, in terms of these devices, changing how we communicate. And it continues to evolve. And today, there's going to be another shift that is starting to percolate in, which is not something that people look at and go, but the techies are going to go, oh, wow, this is really cool stuff. It's just going to be a matter of, oh, my behavior's changed completely than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And that's in the customer care world. So the customer care world has always been driven by what's called synchronous voice engagement, which translates into you have to deal with an inquiry now, immediately. And then the expectation of consumers and customers are that if I've made a call to you, like a call center, and I've got a problem with, say, bill shock on my bill or technical issues relative to my Wi-Fi or my cable television or even my mobile phone, the expectation was that needed to be solved at that point, which then leads to many people waiting many, many hours to get something resolved. Well, by utilizing asynchronous technology, i.e. messaging, you can now shift that burden away from it being immediate, and nor do you have to be making a call to a provider between, let's say, 8 and 6 during your working day. And instead, if it was 3 o'clock in the morning and you've got a problem about a bill, you can send it into, let's say, Verizon or T-Mobile US or Vodafone. You can send it in via text message, and then that gets resolved that way. And then the resolution is also applied with chatbot and artificial intelligence functionality, so to the point where if you are making that inquiry up front, the enterprise itself will be able to identify your sentiment and intent based on the other data elements that are reflected in your own profile, whether it's working with the operator or what your usage profile looks like for any type of service. And that's now starting to infiltrate, if you will. It's starting to get distributed into the customer care world. And what are the numbers that we're talking about? Well, their research analysts, the likes of Gartner and others, estimate that there are over 2 trillion voice minutes that are attributed to customer care engagement annually. So if you could shift that traffic away to messaging, that would alleviate a lot of the pressure inside call centers. And why is that important? Well, most call centers have a turnover rate of about 100% every 4 months because it's a tough job, you know? And back to, if you can shift that expectation within the consumer mindset of what is considered convenient, because in this case, this is far more convenient than you sitting on a phone call for 2 hours. And we've all gone through this where you get the IVR stating you are now 6th in the queue and the expected call waiting time will be 1 hour. Who's going to wait to do that? So that's now just starting to percolate in some of the acronyms that are being called CPaaS, which stands for Communications Platforms as a Service, which is essentially a fancy way of integrating a solution that includes SMS, voice, video, over-the-top type messaging like WhatsApp or WeChat, in-app push messaging, email, as well as artificial intelligence and chatbots, all being coordinated through a data lake and a data pool that is able to manage all this, drawing all this information from all those different access points that you have. So that may not be the sexiest thing in the world, but it's something that is going to be affecting how we all operate going forward.
And for any business leader listening to our conversation today, is there anything you can advise on how businesses can effectively leverage text message to engage with their customers? And also, what are some of the best practices to ensure a positive customer experience without being intrusive or drifting into creepy territory?
Sure. Well, the reality of how we utilize text message today is as follows. Only about 6% of businesses globally utilize text message as a convenient interface with their consumers or customers. And it's a highly convenient. Once made a presentation on rhetorically asking a bunch of guys from Gartner, what's the total addressable market for convenience? Looking as to, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, just that. What's the total addressable market for convenience? Just like any other types of functionality, there's a total addressable market, services addressable market, however you want to categorize it. I was like, guys, it's infinite. It's 100%. Everybody wants something more convenient. Everything, that's the nature of being mobile phones. Why are they called mobile? So you're not tethered to the wall like we used to be 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. So the adage or the recommendation to an enterprise would be, this is something that you can utilize. It is highly secure. It is highly used. Part of the impact of text messaging, in my view, I've never done any research on the psychology of all this, but the reality is that text messaging is glimpsable. There initially was only 160 characters. So you could look at something on your phone and the display would be something you wouldn't need to read. Your brain would automatically recognize those letters in combination, and that becomes the word, which that is true in terms of how our neurosciences work. And so that glimpsability is already embedded in how we communicate as human beings. I don't know about you, but when I was in middle school and in elementary school, we used to fold up pieces of paper into a small size and pass it along to somebody 2 rows over and 3 rows back. Yeah. Well, no different than a text message. So that impact, and it's also reflected in the effectiveness of text messaging, in the sense that it's about 95% or more text messages are read within the first 3 minutes of receipt on average. 3 minutes. And so it has that cut-through capability. If you look at email, the average email is read almost 3 days. It's quite long. Yeah. So that ability to be able to reach out and engage a customer, either on a group basis or on whether you are offering some kind of coupon or discount, or on an individual basis where you're being notified by Wells Fargo or some other bank that there's been a payment made, or there's a decrement on your account, and it's just the verification of all that. Nothing is nearly as powerful as SMS in terms of being able to cut through the noise and provide a convenience communication bridge with your customers from an enterprise perspective. And that's regardless of size, whether it's American Express, United Airlines, or whether it's a small and medium business, or it's your local auto mechanic or beauty salon.
Another big change I think we're seeing in the industry is the emergence of quantum computing and, of course, AI, especially in consumer-focused services such as things like conversational commerce, secure authentication, all big topics for businesses right now. Is there anything you can discuss around that and how these technologies can, again, transform customer engagement? Because it's not just about the tech, it's what it delivers, right?
Yeah, well, the quantum side, that's kind of like over the horizon in the context of new types of computing functionality. And people may not, right now, the discussion is how it would work and the different type of architecture. If you're not familiar with it, the classical, I love this now, that a classical architecture for a computer is essentially bits and bytes, on and off switches. And as I understand quantum computing, we're getting into qubits and quantum mechanics, which is similar to you flip a coin and the coin in the air is in constant motion, which then can be utilized for computing functionality. And you multiply that with coins being up in the air to be able to solve these problems on a simultaneous basis across all these different variables. That's about all I can understand. I don't know about the physics of anything else or how it gets then put in a practical application. But if you look at just being able to process large pools of data, which is why the intelligence community is very interested in these things, because you're able to analyze this type of data and look at the threats that might be out there. But then you can apply it to a number of different use cases. And it's my understanding from talking to some people in the space, this is something that is gotten my interest lately, that one of the leading opportunities for quantum computing is in the telecommunications space, relative to, again, managing large pieces of data, understanding the threats to it, but also everything relative to efficient routers and efficient repeaters on a cell site. I mean, lots of pragmatic applications, not just the theoretical.
And it is incredibly, well, it's very early at the moment when talking about quantum and quantum computing, as you said. And there's a lot of hype as well around quantum safe cryptography and how it could enhance security for sensitive data and communication. Again, very early days, but how do you envision this happening, and what kind of challenges do we need to be addressing and overcoming before even thinking about integrating quantum computing with cryptography and looking or exploring use cases and business cases and what value it can offer? What are the baby steps we need to be taking first?
Well, if from my own examination of innovation and thinking about it between my ears sometimes, I always thought about, if I saw something interesting the first time, I would take note of it. If I saw it the second time, I'd be concerned that I haven't seen what's going on. If I saw it a third time, that would mean I was too late to the game, because the trend has already taken off. So it's a matter of being able to understand the risk and the productivity curve, even the hype cycle, if you will, going from the trough of disillusionment after the hype of potential application, and then over the long term, there's the actual implementation value that's able to be harvested from it. This is something that comes down to the nature of your business, even in the context of SMS interoperability that I talked about at the beginning of our conversation, when, again, I had a blank page in terms of how are we going to offer this opportunity to the mobile network operators. And there were 1,000 of them. How do you segment that out from a sales process? And where do you want to allocate your resources of time, money, talent, number of people, will to be able to overcome the market, or even technology? These are the factors that I looked at. And very quickly, I recognized that, I needed to have a balance between those operators that were willing to take the risk because they were in a highly competitive market. The best place to do that was in Hong Kong. You had back then like 4 different operators in an arena of around 3.5, 4 million people. So it was hyper competitive. I mean, hammer and tongs, literally, in the marketplace. So it was easy to go to one of those operators and say, I've got a new idea. I've got a means for you to be able to have a connection utilizing this on a GSM basis from your operator. But we can then deliver those messages into non-GSM destinations like Verizon in the United States, or AT&T at that time, which was not GSM. And there were a few that I knew that would be like, we're willing to take that risk. Let's try this. Did the same thing in the Philippines and other places where it took off. And that's an indication that they were willing to take that risk. They understood that there was going to be an advantage of it, and they were able to benefit from it just because it became hyper growth scenarios.
And as someone that is a successful entrepreneur and innovator, has seen many hype cycles and that fair amount of disillusionment that sometimes follows, I'm curious, what's your perspective on harvesting innovation and the tools of envisioneering? A great phrase that is, isn't it?
You've asked on deep, haven't you?
And how businesses can apply these tools to stay competitive in this rapidly evolving tech landscape, because they keep saying that, yes, pace of technological change is moving at breakneck speed, but equally, it's never going to move this slow again. So it can be daunting, can't it?
Exactly. There are two things. So those, you just made a reference to a blog that I wrote in 2008. You can find it on mobilepointview.com, and then Google my name with mobilepointview.com. And it was essentially me creating a rubric, a process on being able to identify innovation. And that's where I coined the term innovisioneering, which was innovation, vision, and not engineering, but orienteering, to be able to get a sense of how it all fits within the context of the environment that you operate in. So that was, again, I can direct your listeners, or you can direct your listeners relative to the website, that you can take a little bit, a little deeper dive in terms of my perspective on that. But it goes back to your original comment or your original question as to being open to understanding how these new types of developments are going to make an impact favorably or negatively on how you do business. There's a great book by Reid Hoffman called Blitzscaling.
Yeah.
And ironically, that book's only about 10 years old, but I came around to doing the same thing, which is instead of looking at 0 to 1, because in many startups, for example, they're always trying to figure out what their position is in the marketplace, and going from 0, meaning the startup, to 1 to their first customer. And when I walked into this one instance, as I mentioned, this was a startup called Mobile 365. I convinced the board, because a venture capitalist had invited me to have a conversation, and we recognized that there was going to be a bigger opportunity offshore for this interoperability solution that we were offering with SMS than there would be onshore, meaning inside the domestic U.S. market. But the founders were all focusing on the U.S. market because that's all they knew about. So I kind of opened up their eyes, specifically the board, as to this is a broader opportunity that we can pursue. And on the back end, it'll probably have a greater accretive impact because you'll have a deeper, broader pool of customers than you would if you were just looking at the mobile operators in North America, if you will, which were amounted to maybe 10 that controlled around 99% of the subscribers at that time. And ironically, at that point in time, there was only about 22% of those operators' subscribers were on the GSM anyways. So that in and of itself was the fulcrum in terms of how to be able to shift the perspective. So Hoffman talks about going from 0 to a billion. It's not 0 to 1. And that was the same approach that I was taking, again, before he wrote the book. So it's easy for me to articulate now because many people have read this bestseller, in terms of being able to accelerate and expand your opportunity. And to be able to do that, you have to have the right eye set, the right eye level in terms of where's the horizon here. And I've always worked, by the time that as you become more experienced in the space, I always work in an 18-month to 3-month time frame, because that's where you have biggest commercial impact. You might not be able to change things in 6 months to 12 months. In some cases, you can if you're in a fast-moving startup or fast-moving fledgling company. But in a large company that's doing $1 billion in revenues, it takes a lot to be able to move that needle. So that's usually the year and a half is that first opportunity of movement, and then out to 3 years out. 3 years and beyond, I was once asked to do a business case when I was first in the business, and my boss was asking me, well, I need a 10-year business case on, I can't remember what exactly it was. It's like 10 years. I mean, this business hasn't even been around 5 years. And you're asking me to 10 years, it's a BS in, BS out. And so that's why that was one of the indicators to me as to, okay, I need to change my horizon line, in terms of what the opportunities might be and how to go after them.
And for any startup founders or business leaders at the very beginning of their career, maybe they're hoping to tap into your wisdom and experiences, follow in your footsteps. That's why they listen to podcasts like this. Can you share any insights around the critical factors that might have contributed to your success in generating, let's be honest here, 400 million in tech sales over the last 10 years and engineering multiple trade acquisitions? Anything you'd like to share to those younger listeners?
Well, let me point out that all things are relative, because if I was a salesman for Boeing, that wouldn't be 2 777s. Yeah, and I'd probably be fired. All things are relative. But I guess from my personal basis, I mean, I've had opportunities even before I got into the private sector to be in some pretty daunting rooms, because I had a prior career in the political and policy world. And one of the things I took away from that I have then applied in the private sector was humility and agility. Yeah, I may be smarter than the average bear, but never walked into a room thinking that I was the smartest guy in the room, because there's always something to learn. So that's the humility aspect. And then the agility element is being able to pivot and having an understanding of how to be able to pivot, especially in a startup environment. I went from a quasi-startup, and I say quasi, when you launch a mobile network operator, that technically is a startup. But to be able to get that up and running, you're already dropping $3 billion just for spectrum, and you haven't built anything yet. But we had the mentality of a startup, and that's why I say we were constantly pivoting. Even in the product side, I remember some of the general managers that I worked with at the time, again, I was a novice product guy. They were saying, well, we need to have this cut-through paging solution. So that was like a walkie-talkie is what we would call them over here. And that was of the moment back then in the late 90s, because Nextel, which is a company that had a different type of radio handset that instead of having a telephone call being accomplished through what's called the signal switching that goes on in being able to hand off a phone call, they were utilizing the radio interceptor, the cellular sites, that would allow to have almost like a walkie-talkie experience. And here I am, you being the diligent guy who wants to make a good impression, started doing all the research and realized very quickly, well, that's impossible utilizing GSM technology at that stage. So so I had to convince them that no, this is impossible. But later on, messaging started to take off, and I wasn't responsible for messaging, but I was seeing it and hearing about it because of my exposure to all these other mobile network operators, principally the Nordics in Europe, which is the first guys who were really utilizing text messaging because it was essentially part of the standards functionality, and it was a means of being able to notify a handset that you had a voicemail, for example. There used to have a symbol, an icon that would be activated on your phone. Or there was utilization of text messaging to activate new services, new billing capabilities. It was not something that was being used by consumers, but all of a sudden it started to emerge. And that's when we were like, okay, maybe we should start looking at this as a functionality that we could offer our customers. So we started going down that process, and lo and behold, we recognized that we couldn't bill for it, nor could many of the other operators that were out there, but they were nonetheless pursuing it. So that's the agility aspect of being able to, okay, we need to pivot. This is something new. We got to make that commitment, start making that investment. There's some risk related to that type of endeavor, but what can we do to adjust to that? And the outcome was quite favorable. The phenomena that we have today, estimates are about 15 trillion text messages sent globally every year, and growing, continuing. So,
yeah, and I completely agree with you about being the smartest guy in the room. I had a great quote around that recently, and it was, if you find yourself the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests or listened to this podcast. So I thank you for coming on here, but I'm going to see if I can do something for you in return here. So if I was to ask you if there was a person you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with and why, because he or she might just be listening, who would that be and why? And we'll see what we can manifest together today.
Wow. Gosh, probably somebody like Tim Chang, who is the managing director for Mayfield, which is a venture capital firm. Maybe they've migrated into the private equity realm. And I've met Tim a few times. So Tim, if you're out there, let's grab a beer sometime next time in Silicon Valley. And Tim brings a wealth of knowledge, but also a range of skills. He is one of these guys that has been able to leverage an understanding of multiple types of technologies. And I met him first almost 25 years ago. That would be something that I'd love to refresh that connection if he's out there listening.
We'll send it out into the ether. Let's see what we can create together, see what the universe can do. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, we've had a great conversation today. For anyone that wants to carry this on, find out a little bit more about you and the work that you're doing, what's the best starting point for everything?
Sure. Well, first off, I welcome any conversation. I'm not a transactional. If there's anything that I might be able to help you with relative to strategy, market expansion, I've even been an expert witness on a TCP/IP defense of Verizon and Facebook. The easiest is obviously LinkedIn. That's the first step. Or you can go to my website, which is www.gpvltd.com. It is a shortening of Global Point View Limited, which is the name of my consulting company. And we'd be happy to have a conversation with you on how we might be able to work together.
Awesome. Well, I'll add links to how people can get hold of you on the show notes for this podcast. And I'd love to stay in touch with you. I think we could just talk for hours. So I'd love to grab a beer with you on a tech conference show floor or meet in person in the near future, and also get you back on the podcast later in the year or next year, see how those trends are evolving. Yeah,
sure. And in both cases, it's always good to have these kind of conversations. You never know the direction that they may go, or who might be listening.
Well, thanks again for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
As I said at the very beginning of the podcast, any story that begins with "I was in a bar in Tokyo" gets my vote every time. So a huge thank you to Paul for joining me on the podcast today, sharing his remarkable story and also insights on everything from quantum computing, AI, customer engagement, global telecoms, and messaging trends. So if you're as inspired as I am by Paul's work and want to learn more about him and his projects, you can find him on LinkedIn, but be sure to follow him for the latest updates on any groundbreaking innovations. He really is a great guy to follow in this space. And as always, thank you to everybody listening for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't be afraid to subscribe, rate and review us on your favourite podcasting platform. Your support means so much to me, especially as we continue this battle against algorithms. And if you want to email me, it's techblogwriter@outlook.com. So join me again next time for another deep dive into the world of technology here on Tech Talks Daily. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, never stop learning. And until next time, don't be a stranger.